Hi there, and welcome to part 3 of my deep dive into what Miss Letby actually said on the witness stand during her original trial. As stated last time, after dealing with the handover sheets, Benjamin Myers moved on to the counts on the indictment. As also stated last time, Miss Letby was a real team player, routinely showing the flexibility of a worker on one of those zero-hour contracts. Incidentally, do you remember the public outcry about those things back when certain shady employers first took advantage of the financial crisis to introduce them? I seem to recall even new Prime Minister David Cameron being sufficiently moved by that new law in the exploitation of workers to denounce the practice. Fast forward just 15 years though, and they appear to have been stealthily adopted and quietly accepted as the norm across the service sector. Chances are, even your postman's on one. Of course, with a reputation to protect, Royal Mail distances itself from such exploitation and by outsourcing that aspect of its recruitment to temping agencies. Anyway, come back to Miss Letby. One of the ironies of her case is that if not for that helpfulness to management, she would never have encountered her first claimed victim, Child A, because he died about an hour into a shift she had only agreed to cover that morning on what would otherwise have been a rest day, or strictly speaking a rest night. She only learned which baby she was going to be caring for as designated nurse when she arrived for handover briefing at 7:30 p.m. on June the 8th of 2015, half an hour before the start of that overtime shift. As many will be aware, Child A and twin sister Child B had been born just the day before. As stated on my previous project, the deep dive into the judge's summing up, a summing up which was selective, very biased, and shot through with industrial levels of disinformation, I will not be focusing on the clinical aspects of the counts. Professor Shu Lee's team has, in giving definitive proof from a position of unimpeachable authority that there is no case, and never was one, has, as they say, written the book on the medical side of things, and in doing so, slammed that book shut. That aspect of the prosecution case now stands fully exposed as entirely constructed on the worst combination of disingenuousness, shocking medical ignorance, and thoroughgoing malevolence, so further comment in the area is redundant. It is, however, my belief that in the interest of ensuring nothing like Miss Letby's conviction ever happens again, the absurdity of bringing the case cannot be overemphasized. To that end, I feel bound to mention that Child A was born with a condition called anti-phospholipid syndrome. It is something I have never previously heard of, but I'm going to take a wild guess that it was inherited from his mother. I have not researched how this condition might affect a neonate, but do not doubt that it would seriously compromise health. This is a reasonable surmise, as in an adult it is likened in impact on life to multiple sclerosis. An AI overview of the condition describes it as characterized by a range of symptoms related to blood clot and pregnancy complications. These include blood clots in the legs, or deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolisms, stroke, recurrent miscarriages, and stillbirths. A person does not need medical training to be able to recognize that the presence of such a congenital condition, so compromising to health, even in an adult, might be a relevant factor in their assessment of whether the death of the baby might be readily explicable in a way that does not involve criminal activity. Yes, I'm looking at you, Operation Hummingbird, and especially you, police officer turned politician of the worst kind, Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes. For the record, Miss Letby's evidence of the fateful crash event is as follows. I quote report. Child A's heart stopped and a crash call was put out. Letby says that an emergency Letby says that is an emergency line for doctors to arrive urgently. Dr. Ravi Jairam arrived immediately and another nurse arrived shortly afterwards. Letby says she cannot recall the resuscitation efforts and says it was an unexpected huge shock, saying she had just gone through the doors and then this was happening. Letby said, in reaction to Child A's death, she was stunned, in complete shock. It felt like we had walked through the door into this awful situation. That was the first time I met Child A and Child A's parents. End report quote. Having found herself sharing the traumatic experience of their baby's death more or less at the point of first meeting them, Miss Letby, unsurprisingly for a heavy Facebook user, searched for them at 9:58 a.m. the following morning. I think it is clear to anyone who saw part 2 of this deep dive that even the most gifted statistician in the world would be unable to establish a correlation between Miss Letby's fictitious murder spree and her Facebook activity. Nonetheless, I draw your attention to a couple of minor points that are likely to be overlooked here, with a natural tendency to focus on the sexier aspect of the fact of this Facebook search, that being the prosecution's character slur and lie that this innocent activity was part of being a serial killer, and the media's gleeful perpetuation even of that slur and lie. Anyone who has ever worked a night shift would know nothing is more debilitating of physical and mental vitality. At the end of even an 8-hour shift, one is pretty much a zombie, fit only to fall into bed and desiring nothing so much as that particular event. Christ knows how much greater that sense of exhaustion must be after a 12-hour night. It has to be a truly existential sense of tiredness. This would be the case for a security guard sat in comfort looking at CCTV cameras in a corporate building in the City of London, let alone for a role in a fast-paced, high-stress and therefore emotionally draining environment. If still wired by pumping adrenaline from a dramatic event towards shift's end, you might need to watch half an hour of TV to come down. But to still be awake some 2 hours after getting home, Miss Letby was living on hospital grounds, don't forget, speaks to another level of psychological disturbance, moving, I think, into post-traumatic stress. Whatever had happened during the shift, biologists say that she is going to be zonked out in her bed, recuperating physically and mentally by that point, almost 15 hours after arriving at work to prepare for the shift. But she is still awake, with the night's events still uppermost in her mind. She had clearly therefore been deeply affected by the death. This is unsurprising, as it was undoubtedly her first as a designated nurse, possibly her first ever, and in any case, almost certainly, the first she would have known in her immediate work environment in months at the very least. This is so because she had only qualified to work on the neonatal unit 2 months before, and Child A appears to have been the first unit death of 2015. Prior to doing that specialist course, she necessarily could only have been given the care of babies of standard gestation without serious health issues. With a huge volume of case information, I can fully understand why Benjamin Myers may not have picked up on this, or may have decided it wasn't worth pushing to jurors, but it is nonetheless low-hanging fruit for enhancing the credibility of his client's evidence, which was missed. A further related opportunity missed was one to strike a blow at the prosecution's ghoulish fantasy of a grief collector sub-narrative. Even setting to one side the obvious counter to the ghoul narrative in this particular case, the fact that there would have been nothing to stop Miss Letby performing a search on the parents during the shift, Child A had died only 1 hour into Miss Letby's shift, so, based on what that narrative would predict, she would have had all night to build up anticipation for the psychological payoff of the Facebook search on the parents. It therefore follows, based on the logic of that sub-narrative, that the natural behavior of a person with such motivation would be to secure and enjoy that payoff the moment they reach the privacy of home after their shift. Miss Letby's shift ended at 7:30 a.m. and even with the time taken to do the end of shift retrospective computerized note, she would have already been home for something in the region of 2 hours at the time she did the search on the mother. As I said, it is a small thing, but with the prosecution not having missed a single dirty trick in baselessly defaming your client's character, and a judge who, by now, should have left you in no doubt he was hostile, to put it mildly, this low-hanging fruit in relation to raising doubt in juror minds about the prosecution's picture of malevolence even appears to me a missed opportunity. In any case, what Miss Letby herself said in response to Ben Mize's question as to why she did the search is certainly consistent with my theory that she was obviously affected by the death. I quote report. Letby says it was just curiosity, that she wanted to see the people behind that awful event, and the parents were on my mind. She says it was a pattern of behavior she had, as she searched the name as part of a quick succession of name searches in a short period of time. End report quote. This, I believe, is further evidenced by her testimony in relation to child B on the very next night. From the very next night even. She wasn't actually child B's designated, but was looking after 2 non-indictment babies in nursery room 3. She gives information that she does not have much recollection of that shift, and if not for the diagram showing her on duty in room 3 with those 2 babies, would not have been able to recall who was doing what that night. Having demonstrated such good recall of the night before, that poor recall clearly evidences emotional disturbance and, more than likely, associated lack of sleep having taken a toll, degrading her mental resources in the 12 hours between the 2 shifts. Miss Letby's evidence on child B is all clinical information, nothing of note in relation to the narratives constructed against her. Regarding child C, 2 small issues arise. I checked my notes on the judge's summing up, and he doesn't address either directly, but given that he made so many insinuations, many generalized, questioning her reliability as a witness, I'm going to mention them. Benjamin Mize addresses the first by asking her to give an explanation for now being able to confirm that she was posted to room 3 with 2 non-indictment babies for the night of 13 to 14 June, whereas at the time of her police interview she had been unable to remember. Child C was in room 1, the high dependency room, with Sophie Ellis as his designated nurse. Miss Letby's explanation is that the later learning of the names or the identities of the 2 babies she'd had responsibility for was the memory trigger is a reasonable one. I don't see how anyone could take issue with it, and therefore see no basis for it to be held as something questioning her credibility. The second issue concerns a disagreement Miss Letby has with what her colleague Sophie Ellis stated to police as to when exactly Miss Letby first joined her in room 1. Ultimately, it is immaterial who had the better recall, as Pseudomonas-induced sepsis is what killed the baby. In any case, still having that instinctive trust of the police which characterizes any young middle-class adult who had grown up without ever seeing the inside of a police cell, Miss Letby's response when Sophie Ellis's recall was put to her in interview was to take the information at face value instead of using it as a prompt to test her own recall. Instead of taking the skeptical line, which the interested bystander sat next to her pretending to be a defense solicitor should have hammered into her prior to interview, Miss Letby went rummaging through her knowledge of working practices on the unit and professional experience in general to offer possible explanations as to why she might have routinely entered room 1 prior to child C's actual crash event. Having come to appreciate in the intervening years that police are only human and, as such, find it much sexier to lock people up than to spend time and effort on going the extra mile to get to the truth of a situation, Miss Letby had come to reject her initial unquestioning acceptance that she had been in the room earlier than officially documented. This trial has shown us that, with a couple of years' displacement in time, the recall of even highly educated individuals of events in a fast-paced, high-stress environment ranges from poor to non-existent. And that's before we even get to Jaram's fantasies. Once again, anyone taking this particular difference in recall between Miss Letby and a colleague as evidence that Miss Letby is a liar is giving us more insight into their own psychology and motivations than her own. In truth, the first issue, her at the time of the police interview being unable to remember she had been posted to room 3, is wholly consistent with this position, evidencing, as it does, a very understandable reason why a person might be willing or easily persuaded to rely on the more confident recall of a trusted colleague, that of having no recollection of their own of something that is known from verifiable documentary evidence to have taken place. We now move on to child D, the one where the evidence against Miss Letby includes the child's mother's assertion that at one point Miss Letby was hovering in the room holding a clipboard and had to be moved on. The judge saw fit to remind jurors of this in his summing up, despite the woman's partner not corroborating the claim and the fact that Miss Letby was designated nurse for 2 non-indictment babies in the same room. As I went to some effort to make abundantly clear in my previous project, the analysis of the judge's summing up, in the context of the other information, that action by the judge is questionable and to his discredit. It is, however, only in reading Miss Letby's own evidence that we are able to see the full extent of just how rogue James Goss went in this matter. In the accusatory statement, the mother of child D includes a conversation she claims to have had with Miss Letby in the unit at 7 p.m. Miss Letby has no recollection of such a conversation, and there is hard digital evidence proving it to be a fantasy. Door swipe data shows Miss Letby only arriving at work almost half an hour later at 7:26 p.m. That information is corroborated by a text message sent by Miss Letby at 7:15 p.m. informing someone that she was just leaving for work. The judge did not include the fantasy 7 p.m. conversation in his summing up, but in the context of that recollection being demonstrably false, how could he justify pointing out the allegation of malevolence without also reminding the jurors that the witness providing that so-called evidence had been exposed as untrustworthy in the same document? Miss Letby's recollection of that particular night and around the child D case in general is non-existent. She didn't even remember the baby. Unlike in the child C case, where being made aware of other information after the police interview had triggered memories, everything about child D remained a closed book from the time of her police interviews through to her giving evidence from the witness stand. Her evidence, or lack thereof, is therefore consistent. As stated on several occasions in these videos, poor to non-existent recall in the absence of documentary evidence as triggers is a feature of all witness evidence from the medical professionals who were working in the unit during the indictment period. We will obviously never know, but I would be willing to make a small bet that a review of Miss Letby's work pattern would show the night in question coming towards the end of a stretch of shifts rather than at the beginning. Basically, I'm guessing the absence of recall simply reflects a tired brain, functionality including memory formation having steadily degraded over several days of not being properly restored by quality sleep. Nonetheless, the judge felt it appropriate to remind jurors in his summing up that Miss Letby had told the court that she did not remember the events. Having no recollection of the child or the night's events, unsurprisingly, Miss Letby also does not have or did not have independent recollection of doing the Facebook searches on the parents 3 days after the child's death. The judge, consistent with previous form, naturally found that an appropriate fact to remind jurors of as well. Benjamin Myers then takes Miss Letby onto the twins, child E and child F. Miss Letby has a strong recall of child E, primarily because of visible aspects of the child's final hours of life. She becomes tearful at her recollection of this. The relevant testimony on child E is distressing, but I choose to include it in this video because my sense is that knowledge of it is the surest means for a person of any intelligence to get a handle on the almost caught her red-handed disinformation the mother was possibly groomed by Operation Hummingbird into putting into her statement and seeing it for the piece of nonsense it is. I quote report. The note 0036 hours acute deterioration is made by Letby. She tells the court child E was intubated, was actively bleeding and continued to decline. Becoming tearful, Letby says child E was bleeding from his mouth and his nose. She says child E's parents were present for resuscitation. She denies child E's deterioration was something she had wanted to happen. Following child E's death, Letby says teddy bears were given to child E and child F, and on the parents' wishes a photo was taken of the twins. Letby says she continued to look after child E after the night shift. I repeat, Letby says she continued to look after child F after the night shift. For child E, she said she found his death very traumatic, having not seen that kind of sight before. End report quote. I say piece of nonsense both because of the obvious implications of the information just read and because the reality of the almost red-handed disinformation is that it comes down to 60 minutes. Miss Letby and the documentary records give information that the baby first expressed blood through the mouth at 10 p.m. and the mother is claiming evidence of this at 9 p.m. I'm saying more about it than intended or it merits, but having gone this far into it, I might as well finish. It is disinformation because it involves semantic fraud. Red-handed means to catch someone in the course of or immediately after the criminal act. As such, it is not logically supportable by the facts without the unspoken assumption that any clinical aspect of the child which could conceivably be explained by deliberate harm must have been brought about by an act of deliberate harm, and the person behind that act must have been Miss Letby. The claimed and convicted attack method for child E is air embolism. The associated symptoms of air embolism do not include expressing blood from the mouth and screaming. Setting aside for the moment a challenge to the wholly unrealistic idea that any rational person could reasonably expect that ignoring the screams of a baby already so health compromised as to need to be in the high dependency room of an intensive care unit, when nurse colleagues or doctors or parents could walk in at any moment, could possibly pass without notice. The mother's scenario is that Miss Letby is sat at the computer terminal and her baby is screaming and has dried blood around his mouth. There is therefore no evidence of the alleged and convicted attack method having been witnessed by the mother taking place or having just taken place. If the unspoken subtext of her claim is that what she witnessed was evidence of Miss Letby having just attacked her baby, then she is alleging a different and separate attack on her child by Miss Letby to that which the compromised jurors decided caused the baby's death. This is also unsupportable on the facts and, as explained, sheer malice. The disinformation is calculated to flood the emotional sensibility through a semantic fraud which, in the course of its counterfeit operation, naturally distracts attention from its very presence. As you might have gathered, psychologically manipulative stuff like this offends me, hence my relentlessness in deconstructing such efforts. The reality, though, is that you do not even need to get into the sense of words and the meaning conveyed by language to make a call on this red-handed thing. I quote report. The court is shown the timeline for the night shift on August 3 to 4. Letby is shown administering medication for child F at 9:13 p.m., with nurse Caroline Oakley also present in room 1. The same as child E. Letby is asked if Caroline Oakley observed blood on child E's face at that point, or if it was noted. Letby replies no. End report quote. The sick haters who are emotionally invested in Miss Letby being a monstrous serial killer will say, yeah, she'd obviously just wiped blood away since 9 p.m, hadn't she? But is it really conceivable that a neonate could be so physically distressed as to be making sounds neonates have never been heard to make, and less than 15 minutes later be quiet and settled? Okay, video lengthwise, that seems a good place to pause. I will pick things up in my calling out of the catalogue of dirty tricks against Miss Letby with her child F testimony next time around. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below. As usual, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.